that said, on the motion, this House regrets the dominance of third wave feminism. I will invite the Prime Minister.
Hello. Okay. POIs via chat. I'll just call you when I'm ready to take you, preferably from closing, but opening if not, if closing doesn't have any. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Sorry, my recorder isn't working. 3, 2, 1, go. The image of the woke feminist has killed the feminist movement, and that for a movement that is so important to so many people is extremely regrettable. The first thing I will do is frame out what the debate looks like. The first thing I want to talk about is what the dominance is. It's 3 things. Firstly, it's the main way that people engage with and view the feminist movement. It's the way that feminism is talked about on the media as an organization or as a movement, even if it's not centralized. We think that people generally have a singular view of the movement. But secondly, it's the way that ideology is also pushed through things like the media, through things like feminist literature. Secondly, there's a certain glorification that occurs because of the dominance. So the way that it's manifested in the status quo, even if this was not the initial intention, but the way that it's happened in the status quo is to position itself as the only quote unquote moral way to practice feminism as well. So for example, the third wave feminism prioritizes things like intersectionality to many different identities. If you don't agree with some of those identities, you are not a true feminist under like third wave feminism. But the third thing I want to note is that while third wave feminism originated from the progress made by second wave feminism in the developed world, its influence has also been exported to more conservative contexts. For example, it's the dominant way with which people view feminism in the Philippines as well and interact with it. What does regretting it mean? Obviously, third wave feminism will still exist on the both sides. It's about the domination of it. And so we think on our counterfactual, we think that the broad feminist movement carries the shades of second wave feminism even more. We were willing to defend a world where second wave feminism and the policies that are attached to it are more dominant. We think that one, it's centralized, maybe that there is fracturing within second wave feminism, but there's a general agreement on what the movement ought to fight for and ought to push within terms of its limited resources, because the leadership has a general monopoly on things like ideology and policy priority. Why is it justified even if the leadership is privileged? Because opening opposition will say later that it's led by like white women or rich women, etc. One, we think that the ends of second wave feminism are also extremely important and they haven't been fulfilled yet. The wage gap remains a problem even in developed nations. Domestic violence is extremely common. Abortion has been rolled back in the United States. We think there's still a large group of people that are willing, that are going to opt into this because they feel alienated by the patriarchy, etc. But the difference is that we're going to focus on policies that are just like policies that focus on women as a general group more. We think that will trickle down to minorities anyway, even if we do have to trade off prioritizing them to some extent. First argument, why it has fractured the movement internally and led to opt-out. The first thing I want to note is that third wave feminism is significantly more radical than its previous predecessors for 4 reasons. One, because it takes a stronger stance against institutions like religion or party agendas, which means that you're willing to attack these institutions in the media. Secondly, it prioritizes individual choices even at the expense of other quote-unquote moral goods in society. But thirdly, it also creates a hierarchy of agenda. So for example, prioritizing the needs of women of color, etc. Note that the fourth reason is that it's also contradictory in many ways. So choice feminism is also a result of third wave feminism, but third wave feminism also prioritizes things like intersectionality. This cannot coexist. And that's why the attacks towards feminism has been, for example, debating about what makes a good feminist or what ought to be the priorities of the movement, etc., etc., which means that it's hard for people to buy in. This is important because activism is an extremely hard thing for people to do, obviously. One, because it comes at a personal cost to you. You have to expend time and money and your own personal security into being like active in the movement. You have to change your behavior. Sometimes you have to make social trade-offs. This is an additional cost that the feminist movement is asking of people, and that's why it's extremely hard. What does this mean? One, a lot of opt-out for less radical women who are either less willing or less able to opt into the movement, especially in the hierarchy of agendas that the movement pertains to in the status quo, which means that a lot of women brand themselves as anti-feminist in the status quo, even if the feminist movement does help them. Secondly, it leads to fracturing, like subsidiaries within the movement that are counterproductive to its ideologies. TERFs, for example, or like white women prioritizing their own agenda, all of these different ideologies counteract and fight against one another when it comes to prioritizing things like public policy or discussions in the media. Thirdly, it's easier for institutions like religion, like conservative ideology, to attack you because you seem both exclusionary and also contradictory. You radicalize moderates and tainted the image of the movement, which makes it harder for you to get policies passed. But lastly, even when there has been progress, it's been easier to roll back because there's no singular image of what feminism ought to be. You can brand progress as anti-woman and anti-feminist. That's why, and I want to illustrate what the status looks like for opposite court. Amy Coney Barrett says that she fights for women, but also that she doesn't want abortion because it's morally bad. There are increased rates of conservatism even in the developed world. There are echo chambers of anti-feminism even within relatively liberal states because so many people are disillusioned with the broken promises and contradictions. Even if you don't buy the contradictory part, it's the fact that there's a hierarchy, there are priorities that many people don't agree with. It's more radical, and that's why people opt out. Even when they do get progress on their side, it's progress that it's easy to roll back, and that's why it's bad. Before I get onto the second argument, closing.
During second wave feminism, women were burning bras in the street and loudly asserting that shaving is unfeminist. Do you think that this was non-radical activism? Do you think conservative countries really liked this?
So the first thing I want to note is that that's not the main way that people viewed second wave feminism in your world. The main battle cry of second wave feminism are things like abortion, things like the wage gap. Maybe there is some radical actions that were done by a few groups in your side, but it's for women of color, even though there are still people that suffer, like white women that suffer from things like domestic assault on your world. So that's why it's exclusionary, and that's why you have to contend with that. The last thing I want to note is that progress becomes far less attainable on opposition. One, because it's less centralized. The focus of the movement is split. There's a limited amount of resources. Second, because you have counter ideologies. People within the movement are also fighting against you. Again, maybe there's some fracturing on our side, but it's far more centralized. It's far more monopolized, and that's how you get actual progress that is built on extremely built on extremely strong amounts of support from broad amounts of group, because you don't exclude certain people based on arbitrary factors that are not linked to their to whether or not they're a woman, etc. What have we proven at the end of this prime minister's speech? The first is that it's extremely hard to get progress in the long term. The second is they have some progress on their side, but the progress is easy to roll back, and also that it's extremely difficult for the movement to have any sort of foothold in the in people's psychology because of the fact that its image is so tainted on all fronts. OG, thanks.
All right, sorry. Thank you, Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition. All right, thank you, Elo, for that speech, Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Nice. Give me a sec. The first thing that I want to deal with is that idea that third wave feminism exclusively included minorities because of intersectionality. The first thing that I want to note is that the problems that were most dealt with under second wave feminism, which is the counterfactual that we posit and very explicitly framed from Chelsea, were most acutely affecting minority groups anyways. Like things like the wage gap were oftentimes felt more by relatively more underprivileged individuals, which is why the first and second movement heavily collaborated with Black rights movements in the way and the structure in which they manifested already. That's why the second movement was successful, and it's uncritical for them to assume that just because it achieved intersectionality, that was when we were able to include minorities in the first place. The second thing that I want to note is that this point on dominating these discussions is oftentimes uncomparative. The reason for this is because regardless, presumably, rich white women will probably possess a significant amount of money and capital and fund it into the levers that they particularly want. What is the difference under opening government? The first thing that I want to note is the priorities that exist under a movement that is predominantly governed by values of second wave feminism and the problems attached to it, as opposed to third wave feminism. What we explain is that the transition was premature and the dominance allowed us to skip over those problems in the first place. Skip over the wage gap, for example. Skip over domestic violence, especially for the individuals that we have left behind in the developing world who are still dealing with these problems. And therefore, what happens to that money under opening government is that it's more likely to be funded and pushed towards causes that benefit all sorts of individuals rather than just being relegated to some aspect of choice that could only benefit a specific white demographic of women. That is why, even in a comparison about what the hegemons will do under each particular paradigm, it's obviously worse under opening opposition. Thirdly, do people feel empowered by third wave feminism or not? The truth is that some people could potentially be persuaded by either. Some people could be persuaded by things like being able to have the right to be able to choose. Some people could be persuaded through promises of things like being able to have and fight for a fairer wage gap. What we'll add is nuance. In the vast majority of instances, it's about a way up of what is more proximate to the average individual and what is the most important to them. Because what we'd explain is that oftentimes before people can consider things like choice, oftentimes they have to focus on their own self-sustenance. They have to focus on whether or not they will be beaten in these instances, whether sufficient protections between them and the society that is necessarily relatively more sexist. And therefore, on a matter and weighing off severity, it is obvious that you should cater to these women under our comparative. But secondly, it's unclear to what extent choice is essential for the average individual because things like agency is not always an inherent good, which is why most people in religion, for example, choose to forego some aspects of their agency because that is their own preference to do so. And therefore, it isn't clear to what extent intersectionality and just prioritizing agency by itself is going to be beneficial to the movement. Thirdly, let's talk about whether or not they accept the good kinds of people and why fracturing exists to a far greater extent. What I'd note is that oftentimes the biggest barrier for the feminist movement to get any sort of significant change is that it isn't concentrated, that there are too many of them that are focusing on many different arenas. They aren't voting in unison and voting on the same issues, and it oftentimes causes infighting, such as in the case of race within the feminist movement in the United States, for example. What we'd point out is that there are just certain ideologies that should not belong in the feminist movement. TERFs should not be associated with the feminist movement at all. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists, for example, which are individuals that they leave space for within the context of the movement. That's terrible for a couple of reasons. One, outwardly, since these individuals were oftentimes the most conservative but still dominate the discussion of feminism, or likely to what extent you're going to be able to create a safe enough space for minorities and convince them to want to join and participate in the first place. Secondly, they ask, this is the only way by which we were able to get Kamala Harris into office. But I'd point out, the feminist movement specifically deals with things like the wage gap and things that are inherent to things like sex and gender in the context of women. There are alternatives, strong alternatives for things like fighting for Black rights, for example, such as the Black Lives Matter movement. And so it is still particularly important that the feminist movement is able to cater specifically to what is important to women, even at the cost of sacrificing some sort of social upheaval in that way. Because this is the only way by which, this is the only way that by which you're able to change the levers of power in a significant enough way. Before I go on, opening up.
So just go check this. There is currently calls for an actual wage gap even within the third wave feminism. The difference is what representative would you have that would talk about the current struggles of women within the working conditions that they face, which is different for ethnicity or their vulnerability.
Clearly, you did not listen to the past 5 minutes of my speech. It is about nuance. It is about what the individuals will push for. They push for better things. They push for the wage gap under our comparative, which is why it is significantly better. Importantly, continuing to impact this claim, what I'd point out is that the individuals who need space within the movement, need communities to be built around them, need to feel space, don't have that option under their comparative, are more likely to be lumped in, and therefore the primary vision of the social movement at this point is likely to be white-centric and radical at the same time. Last, they say that this is more radical because women were burning bras in the street. The problem with this is that this didn't really happen primarily in the first and second movement. What happened was this was during the transition towards the third feminist movement, where things become significantly more inflammatory. What we'd explain is that the ways in which these things manifest become significantly worse under their comparative, because it's harder to control absent blocks of individuals when it's not centralized between one governing body. And that's important because being able to assert yourself as a movement and to be able to consolidate all of that political and financial mass is crucial in being able to forward the sorts of goals and advocacies that you'd want as the movement. But importantly, it's this sort of intersectionality and embracing of every single woman and their choices that oftentimes leads to the feminist movement being branded in the worst possible ways as a result. What is the impact of this? One, it's not true that the third wave is the only way by which the feminist movement was able to be intersectional. It was always intersectional. A lot of the votes that they received did come from collaborating with other adjacent social institutions. At minimum, there's no change. But what you do is create and has created a feminist movement that refuses to cater for individuals. That the sorts of advocacies that they cater to and the sorts of advocacies that white women choose to fund, for example, who dominate the discussion, don't affect every single woman, and where they do no longer feel safe because you leave space for individuals who are against the mainstream cultural acceptance for what the movement ought to cater to. But lastly, it's just about principle. If it is true that there are a select number of individuals within the feminist movement who create and have ideas that are tangent to the rest of the movements or even explicitly contradictory, that weakens your position and social leverage because it is considerably easier for governments to perhaps collaborate with some areas of the movement, but not. That's why it becomes easier to ignore minorities. For these reasons, opening government.
All right, thank you, DPM, for that speech. DLO.
For PYs, just raise your hand. I'll see you. This is a retrospective debate. By the time of the 1990s, the vast majority of the general pushes of the feminist movement were largely granted and achieved in vast majority of cases. Things like suffrage, affirmative action, and albeit it might not be to the perfect degree, it at least met the threshold of what opening government wanted, that at the very least people were accommodated at the general level, which is why you had a lot more political and economic participation amongst individuals. At this time, though, the most important thing for the vast majority of people who were the most vulnerable was that their own struggles were out of the general population and were not being heard. People who were, for example, hijabi women who needed more accommodations because were actively being discriminated by the very feminists who thought that they could protect them in the vast majority of cases. People who came from POC or religious backgrounds that the general feminist population didn't agree with, and instead of accommodating them, they ostracized them and excluded them to the worst degrees. And then when on either side of the house, it is not true that on their side, you will have general accommodation of all women. That is simply just factually not true. What happened on their side, with an absence of the third wave feminism and a lack of platforming people who are the most vulnerable, was not inclusion, it was exclusion, not just by people outside of movement, but also the people that you called your own. So if you want to say that these people were including other individuals on your side, I'm sorry, that's simply just not true. The first thing I'll talk about is winning on the OG metric of efficacy of the movement. What do they say here? They say that you have a more fractured movement because of hierarchy and opposition to institutions. Their conclusion is that it invites opposition. Firstly, I'm not sure whether this is exclusive. The second wave feminism would have also been radical and historically was also radical per the illustration of CO, but also just realistically, right? If you're not doing it in a decentralized way, the fact that it's centralized means that there's more often things like groupthink that happens under your side, which is why more and more often you are seeing more riots that happen historically under theirs. But secondly, the flip to this is that it's actually much easier to temper radicalism if it's needed under our side, for the reason that you have far more diverse experiences and far more people who can counter each other's biases. So it's far more likely actually that you're more likely to be more PR better under our side of the house. But even if it is exclusive and you have to take in this harm on OO, it is less important for the reason of the second issue that I'm going to talk about later, that they simply have no answer to people who do need protection. So even if you do trade this off, I'm not sure why this is more important than the things we already talked about coming from Jaed. Clearly, if we're talking about a point in time in which a lot of the general stuff was already fighted for generally, then I'm not sure why they have any answer towards people who do need help. Now, they don't have any defense towards that. Here is the part that is more substantive though. Infighting doesn't disappear prior prior to the dominance. Buy-in is much lower on Gov when you don't platform intersectionality. Two reasons. One, because people self-select out of fear or intimidation for the reasons that Jaed gives you, that these people feel more likely that they don't belong in that movement. But secondly, those who wish to evolve the movement, assuming they are part of it, are less able to do so, because even if they speak out, they won't be as respected, because as DPM explicitly concedes, these people who are white, who are privileged, would have tried to funnel as much effort to do it on their side of the house, which means you can't draw as many viewpoints, you can't make these platforms more complex. What does that mean? It means actually on their side, this agreement still exists, guys, but it manifests far more insidiously. It looks like less critical mass. It looks like an externality that hurts other women because of the intro I explained that you are more combative of us versus them. Why is it solved under our side when you explicitly have the narrative of dominant intersectionality? One, because the signaling effect shows and tells people that you do have a space and you do belong here, and even if some people don't want you here, there is a select safe space that exists for these individuals. So these people by nature will select into the movement, increasing numbers and therefore flipping the open government metric. But secondly, as Jaed explains, to no response, you shift the Overton window, which means if people think that you are radical by the nuanced parts of the movement, concessionary leverage is greater for other more basic privileges and rights, which means that we are far more able to get the things that they explain because they don't have any actual mechanism to how to get these things better. What is the weighing? One, a higher scale of people, as I have just proved, means that you have higher critical mass, which is prerequisite to open government, because it means that you have more people lobbying, more people participating, and more external legitimacy, because you look like you are actually representing a bigger group of people, which means that you have more political legitimacy to politicians who want to pander to you. But secondly, even if there is infighting, this is productive infighting versus on their side of the house, where it allows for pushes to have less and less accommodations of these individuals because you are more combative under their side versus forcing people to come to the table under ours. Second point then on protecting the dignity of minority women, before that, closing.
The need for critical mass seems like a pretty persuasive reason why second-wave feminists like Gloria Steinem often gave explicit platforms to working-class women to express themselves. You don't need an explicit narrative of intersectionality to ensure that white women aren't hijacking your movement, and you have every reason to avoid it because you want critical mass.
No, absolutely not. Like, it's on your side of the house where a lot of the changes are centralized towards privileged individuals. Because what use does a rich white woman have for any working class individual benefit? What benefit does an individual, white woman have for, more inclusion of other religious or minority backgrounds? Like, obviously, in the vast majority of cases, by virtue of a script of characteristics, you won't have these things pushed under your side. This is just a non-starter. Secondly, then, protecting the dignity of minority women. They say that you platform exclusionary people, but this misunderstands choice feminism, right? Which is that, yes, you might have biases towards other individuals, but the fact that you have basic identities of, protected attributes means that even if you have biases, you're not allowed to express them in harmful ways other individuals. So yes, you might have biases that exist, but it's only under our side where these things are protected, whereas on their side, there's free reign to exclude them because they're not part of the central motive of the movement. The problem with government's hierarchy is you have to exclude nuances. DPM's response is to say, well, a lot of these changes are things that would benefit minorities as well, but obviously not, right? What about the discussions of religious background, of gender fluidity, of trans fluidity, that things did not exist until the third wave and until it was dominant? We explain key reasons why dominance was necessary, and this is me rebuilding Jaed. Three things. One, explicit platforming ensures a space for diverse people to exist and be protected. So if feminists disagree with POC practices on their side, they would actively demonize them because they were seen as combating the movement directly, whereas on our side, it is not seen as combative, and these people are at the very least protected from the baseline microaggressions that would have hurt their lives tenfold. Secondly, dominance allows explicit prioritization of minority services and communities. The only way we were able to protect Muslim women in the Philippines was the creation of explicit donation drives, etc. And this, paddles down to a lot of different contexts, which is exclusive because it otherwise would not have received any attention. So even if you might have tokenistic representation, actual action only exists on our side. But thirdly, if there is a push for change by the movement, now it requires democratization. So if you want general pushes, obviously, if it doesn't harm minority communities, they would obviously agree to it. But the only time when they disagree with it, right, is when it does encroach on their rights, and therefore that means that you have to have more discussions to limit the amount of harm. This obviously maximizes choice for the most vulnerable individuals because we minimize the amount of harm that these people have, because on their side of the house, they are collateral, they are enemies, and they are demonized by the people that they claim are protectors.
All right, thank you, Diallo, for that speech, member of government.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
I've been having a few internet issues, so I'm just going to keep my camera off if that's all right, just so I don't cut out. Then with that, I will begin. 2 lines of extension from Closing Government. First, on why society becomes substantially less feminist in the presence of choice feminism. And secondly, on why choice feminism is worse at centering the experiences of women in developing countries uniquely due to sex positivity. First, on why society becomes less feminist. Opening Government gives 4 mechanisms on radicalism, all of which are basically entirely assertive. They say, like, there's a stronger anti-institutional stance, you prioritize choice, you have a hierarchy of agendas, and there's internal contradictions. None of these inherently mean you're more radical. None of these mean you're inherently going to message in a bad way. And they're also vulnerable to the opening opposition responses about tempering radicalism on their side or preventing groupthink from forming. So we're going to be extremely explicit in explaining why on our side of the house, the second wave feminist movement is going to be less radical and more effective at messaging to the vast majority of people, and a homogenous movement is going to be able to better play respectability politics and be more savvy. There's 2 reasons why feminism is likely to be done extremely poorly on their side of the house. Firstly, their form of feminism likely involves a lot of built-up resentment towards men or white women, which means you actively message against them. You perceive these people to be your oppressors because of the ways that multifaceted oppression dynamics manifest. So it is not only the fact that a woman is white, it is the fact that she is white relative to your group of Black feminists specifically, which means that resentment begins to dominate your messaging as intra-feminist discourse increases. Secondly, there is a media attention effect which creates a race to the bottom. This is because radically controversial tactics garner more attention relative to other feminist chapters, which creates a social signaling effect where you have to climb internal social hierarchies within feminist peer groups by either bashing other women who are insufficiently feminist or by creating the most radical voices to rise to the top. Why critically is second wave feminism different? First, you have recognized leaders of discrete organizations. This means you have more media training or capacity to media train your leaders to moderate your message and more incentives, since you need to play big tent politics to balance the interests of moderate and radical fashions. You're able to avoid groupthink through this big tent mechanism as well. So you have to balance the interests of a working class feminists and rich white feminists in the same movement. You're exposed to more perspectives, which moderates your messages and views. But secondly, by simply being more palatable to the messages of the elite, by demanding far broader institutional level changes. So if you're demanding things like the pay gap, men don't have an inherent reason to necessarily want to oppose that. Whereas if you're demanding extremely specific policies that might offend the sensibilities of men much more strongly, then that means they have less of an incentive to inherently buy in than they might otherwise have due to social contact. The implication of this is twofold. First, you get more financial and political capital on our side of the house as the feminist movement is more organized and more effective at actually doing feminism. But secondly, the rest of society simply becomes anti-feminist at a much slower pace. You get fewer Andrew Tates, fewer manosphere types rising up in response to third wave feminism, aggressively promoting choices to women, which causes them to backlash in extremely harmful ways because they're able to selectively misrepresent the feminist movement.
Centralized groups can only form in highly developed contexts. The problem is that that is where there is less criticism that actively is opposition to a lot of the core cases and causes of minorities.
Or contact with women in their lives. But if the feminist movement they perceive a radical to individual experiences in their lives, this is the tipping point on moderate buyout. Secondly, on why second argument then on why you're worse at centering the experiences of women in developing countries uniquely due to sex positivity. And I want to note this is entirely independent of the radicalism class. So even if you believe that second wave feminism is completely as radical, it is about the types of things it is radical about, specifically related to sex. The characterization here is that third wave feminism emerged in the West in the 90s through a combination of choice and sex positivity. So movements like free the nipple, sex work is real work, that we ought not to slut shame, etc. This substantially increases fears of feminism in areas where you're afraid of women's sexuality. These areas have strong religious or cultural narratives towards modesty, filial piety, the sanctity of virginity, marriage, and chastity. These things are especially important in these societies because these societies often evolve forms of benevolent chauvinism as part of religious narratives due to the fact that women historically demanded protection from men. So there's often a special sanctity placed on women and the role of women in the sexual marketplace. This means that there's an especially strong sense of backlash to the perception of third wave feminism as being more sex positive and more sex positive discourse. Moreover, there's a lack of cultural familiarity and optimism bias where feminists who message about these things in the West do not have a strong internal core to moderate their messages, creating echo chambers, which means these messages are disseminated in even more harmful ways. Why does second wave feminism avoid this problem? First, you have substantially more sex negative elements. Many second wave feminists were critical of things like porn or were allied with conservative groups in order to ban it. fit in many places, meaning that you don't directly offend the sensibilities of these places. But secondly, insofar as your platform is about broader, less controversial elements, things like workplace discrimination, you never give credence to more radical sex-positive elements in the first place because there's simply fewer issues upon which you can converge. So the odds of splintering and advocating for these types of things simply don't exist to a much stronger extent on our side of the debate. Hang on, I just saw in chat. Can we pause real quick? I just said sorry, he cut out for me. Can I still be heard?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I just saw that. I stopped at 508. Is that roughly right? Okay.
Yeah, same.
Anyways, I will continue in 3, 2, 1. There are 3 clear impacts to this. The first clear impact is that there are fewer political crackdowns on feminism. So in governments that are extremely conservative, there are often strong crackdowns as a result of this. So for instance, South Asian universities enforcing curfews on female populations, or other types of political crackdowns on feminist organizing and advocacy, which impact create as a result of these sorts of things. What this implicates is that there's a lot of direct political opposition to feminism as a result of it violating these narratives around sex and the importance of it in an individual woman's life. Before we move on to the second impact, opening opposition.
So centralized groups can only form in highly developed contexts. The problem on your side is that you remove any sort of criticism from being able to be acknowledged within there because it is more oppositional, and you remove developed context out of the occasion.
So
Sorry, I can't hear MG right now. I don't know if this is just
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, cut out for a
Yeah.
few.
And there was also a moment earlier in the speech where MG cut out for me. When
like-
yeah, sorry.
Did I cut out again? God damn it. Okay.
Yeah, so you're audible again. Sorry, like
Okay.
the earlier cutout, I thought you were pausing to take POI, but yeah, anyways.
Okay.
Yeah, you can start from like responding to the POI.
Okay.
And it's
Yeah.
like 6 at the moment, like 6
Alright.
minute mark.
Okay, I'll give myself 1 minute. Okay, sorry. Having a few internet issues here. Okay. So let me just remember what I said. Okay. Responding to the POI. The first part of that is untrue. You can obviously have centralized movements in the developing world too. On the second part, you have a substantially greater ability to affect against internal criticism and radicalism when you are representing interests in a big tent. I already described the moderating incentives above. The second impact here is that oftentimes these policies play an extremely important tipping point in elections in the developing world or in more conservative cultural contexts. So the recent South Korean elections were basically like a meaningfully a litmus test on feminism and the 4B movement. These are obviously extremely important for getting things like pay protection, defenses against acid attacks, broad buy into the feminist movement, etc. But finally, I think there's just a broad acceptability of casual sex, which is extremely bad. Social norms against stable monogamous relationships are often extremely important for defending women in developing countries. These things are better for actually protecting women and their interests. This enables men to invest less in relationships. Often it carries risks of disease in many parts of the world with poor norms around sexual health. So I think all of these things are extremely bad for the most marginalized women in these particular contexts, and give an extremely large and extremely clear margin on the ways in which the feminist movement is better for people. Incredibly proud to propose.
All right, thank you, member of government, member of opposition.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The dominance of third wave feminism leads to a push for far better policies which affect very many people around the globe. First step of this argument, pre-dominance of the third wave feminism, I want to talk about what the primary agenda of feminism actually was. As CG concedes its skepticism of porn, it's also skepticism of sex work and pushes for things like harsh crackdowns on sex work. It also involves some skepticism of queer men, queer women, for example. So see Frieden, for example, expressing skepticism of the lavender agenda. And as opening government points out, it also to some extent fought for the rights of middle income women, for example, to have have seats on corporate boards or to gain greater protection in the workplace. I know what they could possibly say. If third wave feminism hadn't emerged or become dominant, second wave feminism could have evolved to include other women too. This is also implicit in the CGPOI. There are a couple of reasons this isn't true. One, many of CG's other arguments even concede this. So look at what's happening right now post the dominance of third wave feminism. We've seen a rise of sex negative feminism, where wokeism has been on the decline, and many conservative views have arisen in feminism again. On top of which, it historically was unlikely that you included many women within your movement. And this is for the reason that the wealthy white women that Top Half talks about had unusual influence in the movement. OO tags this, but they don't explain why this is true. The structural reason why this is true is because many of these wealthy white women had more time to take off from work for the reason that they had relatively more economic privilege. They're not, for example, focused on working 2 different jobs at a particular time, on top of which they can donate to the movement to a greater extent, meaning that the movement is more beholden to its interests. They might say, well, wealthy white women themselves change their beliefs, but this is unlikely for the reason that you have strong moral convictions, religious convictions about these views. So you won't change your beliefs, even if it's hypothetically strategic for you and your movement to do. On top of which, there's a strong chilling effect against minorities within the movement speaking out about their beliefs. The fear that they would be judged by these wealthy white women for talking about who they are as queer women. On top of which, when you focus on second wave feminism, there's also a stronger academic focus on, for example, the Dworkin-McKinnon Accords. You've seen relatively more jargony and academic, which implicitly excluded very many women. So this means the stances that you take on their side of the house are reasonably regressive. Step 2, this is harmful. Several important illustrations of how it was harmful. The first way is that in an extreme context, you often adopted policies which very strongly excluded queer women. See, for example, second wave feminist shelters, which explicitly said women-born women are only allowed in these particular shelters. Illustration number 2, even if opening government is right, and you, for example, got policies that, for example, crack down more harshly on domestic violence, this is terrible. Why? Because it often involves things like carceral feminism, stronger penalties against domestic violence. But this is terrible because recidivism happens. The men who wind up going to jail don't stay in jail forever. On top of which, they likely get involved in criminal activity behind bars because they're, for example, in a relatively desperate position. They need to join gangs for protection. That means they're more likely to continue committing crime once they leave jail. On top of which, they have very strong resentment against the state now, which means that you're unlikely to actually change their views. They don't reflect meaningfully about how they can become a better person. Third illustration of how this is harmful. It also just led to more crackdowns on the sex work industry, particularly because second wave feminists were morally opposed to sex work and morally opposed to porn, as MG explicitly concedes. And these crackdowns were pursued in extremely harmful ways, not rehabilitative ways. A couple of reasons why this is true. One, CG's own extension concedes that conservative ideologies will crop to the top. You think that porn and prostitution are morally bad, so you're less sympathetic to, for example, rehabilitative approaches toward things like porn and prostitution in the first place. So you're more likely to favor things like criminalization of working in prostitution to a more significant extent. Tons of women are thrown into prison even though they had to, for example, become prostitutes out of economic desperation. But let's be charitable. Maybe you pursue something like the Nordic model. That's a major safety issue for workers because now workers preemptively become fearful of even going to authorities in the first place because they might get in trouble even if you potentially offer them benefits. On top of which, when you crack down more harshly, that leads to regulatory arbitrage, i.e. the specific brothels that are operating in one area like Sweden go elsewhere, and then guess what? You have even weaker regulations elsewhere, so less protection for those individual workers. Step 3 of this argument, this dominance of third wave feminism effectively changed these attitudes and unified women around better causes. Empirically, third wave feminism converged on things like decriminalizing sex work rather than these harsh crackdowns, but also stronger intersectional policies. So for example, caring more about including queer women, including trans women, in movement discussions like OO says, but more importantly, giving them active resources like access to your mutual aid, and it had a stronger focus on reproductive rights for women. Step 4, this led to a stronger push for better policies, and this push will be successful. Reason number 1, the people involved in your movement are far larger on our side of the house because we still get support from wealthy women. The dominance of third wave feminism doesn't mean that wealthy women suddenly leave the movement. Number 1, because wealthy women in later generations, especially with the dominant, grow up believing it to be true. So they buy into narratives like, I have an obligation to use my privilege to help other women. And the feminist movement can be pretty convincing because you still share emotional experiences with other women in the movement. You get catcalled just like other women do. So you're relatively at the margin, more likely to listen to the views of other women within the movement. But this doesn't happen on their side of the house for the reasons that I gave in the first burden of this argument. DLO says you can counter each other's biases, but they don't give a reason why the conversations that you have with other women are actually convincing. We give give you the reason why you have convincing conversations. But secondly, game theoretically, it just made more sense for wealthy women to buy in, because it's like, if I support goals for queer women, they'll support mine. Whereas on like the alternative, you're not supporting each other, so therefore you're both worse off. So the end point is you still have a good number of wealthy women on our side of the house, even if not all wealthy women remain within the movement. So they keep donating, but you also get those wealthy women on top of poor trans women, on top of women of color. But also international cooperation is far easier on our side of the house. The reason for this is that exogenously, many institutions like the UN and the World Health Organization are strongly in favor of things like decriminalizing sex work. They have pro-queer attitudes. They're relatively more in favor of decriminalizing sex work because they look at the evidence that things like stronger criminalization policies, which GovBench explicitly pursues, increase things like HIV rates. So what that means is, on our side of the house, your movement can cooperate with these institutions to, for example, then work with governments. This is why South Africa right now is working with the UN and feminist organizations in order to implement better decriminalization policies, which are relatively better and healthier for women. But also, there are many lower burden ways that you can impact this claim. Namely, we can get local change even in relatively liberal areas, whereas the areas where there are crackdowns, like CG says, are relatively lower margin anyway. These are extremely conservative contexts where it's relatively more difficult to change individuals' minds. Why do we get better policies on our side of the house? One, when we decriminalize things like sex work, reporting is a lot easier. Sex workers get fewer STIs. They're not needlessly thrown in jail, and society becomes more accepting of them. But also, we get more of the intersectionality that I mentioned before, independent of government policy, i.e., the mere fact that we take up this advocacy of we should be more accepting toward these women means at the margin, women also convince men in their lives. They spend more time trying to convince moderates that this advocacy is true and people are more accepting. But also, even if CG is right and people do things like have more casual sex, they talk more about how to do it safely, especially because they would likely do it anyway.
All right, thank you, Member of Opposition, Government Whip. Okay, thank you, Government Whip, Opposition Whip.
POIs verbally, please. Cool. 3, 2, 1. The problem down the government bench, which I would have pointed out to Tejas and POI if he'd taken me, is that they proudly claim these examples of radicalism that occurred in the second wave movement. Yeah, guys, the bra burning was great. They platformed Black women and working class women. And then they also argue, no, it actually is not radical. That second wave feminism was so common sense and normal. And now it's so radical and ineffective. I'm going to go team by team dealing with efficacy and impacts, because every team is lacking on both except for Matt. Let's start with CG. They say several things about why second wave feminists are more widely persuasive. The first thing I want to point out is that this debate is not this house regrets or supports second wave feminism. We are very happy about the achievements that second wave feminists made in the US. And in fact, under the decentralized model of intersectionality, many feminists in other countries are pursuing similar goals right now because that's something that decentralization allows them to do. All we are arguing is that intersectionality is good these days, in addition to the second wave that already occurred. So why are they incorrect that second wave centralized feminism is just so much more goated? The first thing they say is they were widely persuasive because they needed critical mass. First response, not all feminists in the second wave were actually that forward-thinking and that singularly focused on getting policy change. Many feminists had different goals, such as pursuing personal liberation from men and from romantic relationships with them, and trying to convince other women to see the light and to join them in their celibacy and in their refusal to engage with men until they made different changes. Second response, government has more centralization, but not infinite centralization, because under second wave feminism, there were women who held up signs reading "Kill all men" at protests. There also were local organizations that chose bad directions, that chose radical directions, using their centralized power, and led all the women to burn the bras on the streets and things like that. Here's the weighing. The ability to demonize feminism is scalar. You only need one woman with unshaven armpits and burning her bra on the street to fuel weeks or months of news segments, of politicians' tirades condemning these people, of back and forth unearths of like interviews where the feminists are on the defensive, trying to disavow these people, but struggling because they're people who were part of actual feminist organizations, who were at sanctioned protests, and who weren't stopped in the moment. So I don't think that just because there's critical mass and centralized leadership, you actually get this. Second thing on centralized leadership, or third, I guess, is that often the people who are most radical are the ones who rise to the top. They just assert that they have media training. Not always. And even if they do, sometimes they don't care about the media supporting them, because lots of second wave feminist theorists were against, like, going after just trying to get the mean to support them, and rather wanted to shift the Overton window. And so the people who are most passionate, who are most willing to sacrifice their personal time, who don't care about having a job, are the ones who end up being the leaders. Second thing CG says is that fragmentation means there's competition between feminist movements. No, that's not true, because often different feminist movements under intersectionality are in different geographical areas, are representing different kinds of women, are trying to convince different politicians to change their opinions, or different local donors to donate their money. They don't have to compete. A feminist in Jordan and a feminist in Chile have literally no need to beef online in order to get the same set of donors. Then they say you offend conservative governments and countries far less. I think this is false. Separatism and radicalism was a central ideology of the second wave feminist movement. You literally say, guys, that the second wave feminists were all for contraception. So there is some amount of sex positivity that happens, and then the scalar ability to demonize occurs, but also you have large swaths of women absolutely rejecting traditional femininity and traditional feminine norms. I think that telling people we don't need men and we are advocating for women to stop fucking men is way more radical and way more likely to prompt backlash from religious governments who want people to reproduce than saying we think people should have safer sex. Other thing is that a lot of people in conservative countries like sex. Like Saudi Arabia is literally liberalizing and secularizing on the whole right now, because the men there generally kind of do like sex and drinking. It's not actually clear to me that you are so demonized within conservative countries when you do this. No, you should have taken me, Tejas. Then they say crackdowns occur in these countries. Yeah, I think crackdowns occur more on our side. I've already flipped this. Final thing they say is you have easy and simple priorities like contraception and the gender pay gap. Here is my weighing. First, for these things. It's really persuasive to argue for contraception by saying women are equal people who should have a choice with what to do with their bodies. It's really easy to argue for, women getting equal pay by saying women should have more freedom in their lives, women should have more choice of which jobs to do, and they should be treated equally underneath those jobs. This is a very persuasive phrasing to the average developing country. It's education. Feminists all around the world are still arguing persuasively for these things because, choice, decentralization allows them to do that, rather than when you have one centralized movement saying we are all going after contraception now, when that might not be the most efficient policy priority for every single different feminist movement around the world at the moment. Yay, we get more efficiency. We flip that too. I'll take opening at this point.
So this extension is false. First and second wave feminism were also exported to developing countries. The difference is in the kinds of ideologies that were forwarded. So for example, choice and intersectionality within third wave feminism, which by the way are contradictory, and you have to prove why that's successful.
What do you mean? Okay, it has been successful. Women have gained voting rights everywhere, yes, but also contraception increased massively, especially in places like Africa and South America. Women's wages are rising around the world. Women's participation in STEM, in higher education, I don't know, a lot of my family's in Jordan, so many fucking women study engineering there these days, which wasn't the case in the past. Sorry, you're just wrong about this. On OG, they say that third wave feminism is more radical. False, it's much less radical than burning bras. They say agency is not persuasive. I've already dealt with this. Agency is extremely persuasive because people like being able to do things for themselves and generally feel that they're good at choosing stuff. They say that there's you allow harmful women in your movement. I think that's okay if these harmful women give you money and give you support. And also it's pretty easy for minorities to chill in their own decentralized feminist communities under third wave feminism. OO just says you include people more. It's unclear to me why this is the end goal. Matt shows that we get better policy and better treatment of women, especially for those who are most oppressed, but also we just think that this is more persuasive and allows more efficient pursuit of different policy priorities in different areas, which means that we get the most change. We oppose.
All right, thank you, Uplift, and thanks everyone for the round. Yeah, please leave the breakout room so me and the judges can deliberate.
Thank you for the round.
Attributable to third wave feminism, such that this response became less relevant by the end. So that's how I saw the opening half. Moving on to closing government. So closing government broadly brings in some vertical extensions on why backlash and less buy-in is more likely when you have a dominance of third wave feminism. Essentially, the mix here are that one, the feminism in opposition side has built-in resentment against men or white men, and secondly, that there is an emphasis on sex positivity, such as decriminalizing sex work and so on, which invokes backlash from the developing countries. Yeah, so those are the substantive contributions. I'll discuss some of the responsive later on when I'm comparing CG to CO, but that's what I get from member in general. The way that this gets weighed up against opening government is twofold. Firstly, from opening government, it was a bit unclear why second wave feminism is necessarily moderate. In that, I think a lot of the opening government's harm relies on the third wave feminism antagonizing religion, antagonizing traditional institution, whereas the second wave feminism not doing so, which I think is challenged throughout the debate. Whereas I think closing government has more specific explanation on why the particular agendas of third wave feminism was uniquely vulnerable to invoking backlash, such as resentment against men or such as the sex positivity. They also provide comparative as to why the second wave feminism used to be more sex negative, which is, I think, a clearer comparison as to why the backlash is less likely in comparison to opening government, who argues that third wave feminism is radical, therefore it invokes backlash, but doesn't really supply much reason why the second wave feminism is any less radical than third, such that I think closing government is able to win against opening government on the ability for them to prove the radicalization. But the second thing I want to also note is I think closing government provides clear pathway to receiving change, which is to say, in Government Whip, they point out that merely getting women on board is insufficient because in order to get policy changes, you need to have a degree of buy-in from men in order to flip the election and so on. And therefore, I think the mechanization from closing government on how you get the change and the final outcome of getting policies to reform, I think is much more clearly provided by closing government than opening government, where you say that the movement gets less radical, maybe it becomes more palatable, but then I'm not really sure what happens after that and who is benefited as a result of the changes that you addressed. So that's how I think CG gets above opening of government. Against opening opposition, I want to note two things. Firstly, closing government responds by stressing that some of the inclusion that opening opposition wants can still exist, given that second wave feminism still have strong incentives to include, say, working class women. Obviously, the movement theoretically has incentive to increase as many people as possible, such that they are able to get policy change and so on, which I would observe wasn't fully responsive to opening opposition because all points to some specific women that gets additionally included through third wave feminism, i.e. queer women or developing countries women or religious women and so on. But I think what CG is able to do is still reduce the margin of women that gets excluded by suggesting that had we not have third wave feminism, the second wave feminism would have evolved in a way that still includes some marginalized women. And therefore, I think it mitigates some of the opening opposition push. But additionally, I think what CG is able to prove is kind of similar to how O won over OG by explaining that, even if the agenda is noble, you don't get buy-in and therefore you don't get policy change. CG is able to explain that because the specific agendas pushed forward by the third wave feminism is particularly controversial, like sex positivity, it in fact alienates more people in the developing countries, which is, I think, the thrust of opening opposition case, such that I think CG is able to, one, significantly reduce the degree of inclusion, but secondly, explain that the agendas actually are more vulnerable to backlash, such that it becomes less likely that the movement becomes successful, is where I think CG is able to flip opening opposition. Finally, on closing opposition, I'll first compare CO with CG, because I think that this was the closest comparison and where the split occurred. So CO brings broadly two main contributions. The first is they explain swaths of reasons why the second wave feminism were pretty problematic, such as them being queer exclusionary, or they advocated for carceralist approach, and they cracked down on sex work and so on. I think this first contribution, although it was pretty persuasive, was effectively responded to by government whip when they explained that, one, decriminalization on sex work probably still hasn't occurred in most countries. The full decriminalization happened only in New Zealand, which means that even if the third wave feminism became more, I guess, sex positive and pro-sex work, it has been broadly unsuccessful. And then secondly, they also supply some reasons why carceralist approach is not always bad, such as, having longer carceral time reduces the capacity for people to commit crime, or that it increases deterrence and so on and so forth. So I think that's some of the reasons supplied by closing opposition on why third wave feminism is straightforwardly good, because second wave feminism had a lot of problematic agendas were well responded to. The main clash then becomes which side is more effective in getting change. Here, I think closing opposition supplies some pretty persuasive responses to closing government's mechanizations. So firstly, they point out that the claim about how feminism in opposition is more resentful against men, Upwith explains that this is relatively symmetrical as well, because the second wave feminism still had agendas such as gender separatism and so on. So CG kind of disproves the claim from, CO disproves the claim from CG that the third wave feminism is uniquely resentful against men. Additionally, they also provide or flag that if second wave feminism was advocating for things like contraception, presumably that also has an element of sex positivity. Obviously, I think CG can say, well, the moment where you start advocating for pro-sex work, maybe the degree of sex positivity increases. But the issue with this is so in as much as the way that CG impacts this is sex positivity leads to backlash in the developing world, I'm slightly unsure after the response from Upwith as to if the increase in margin of sex positivity in third wave feminism is or reaches the threshold of unlocking the backlash in the developing countries uniquely. I think Upwith is able to cast a shadow of doubt and explain that, well, these backlash would have existed anyways. And because predominantly that argument applies to countries that are already conservative, the changes are relatively marginal. So I think by this, CO is able to respond to some of the claims from closing government on the efficacy of the movement. And in addition to that, closing opposition has some explanations on why third wave feminism is uniquely able to get changes. That firstly, that wealthy women still believe in intersectional causes. The explanation essentially is because these wealthy women are socialized or exposed to third wave feminism from the outset, such that they also feel a duty to care about intersectional causes, which means that they still stay in the movement. And I think this also responds somewhat to opening government as well. And the game theoretical incentive, international organization, so on and so forth. I think those are the ones that those are the claims that I get from CO. The response from CG, I think, is but merely having wealthy women is insufficient, because you need to have other non-wealthy women or men on board in order to get policy change. The reason why I don't think this response is particularly successful is because throughout the substantive, CO explains why, one, that they actually get more than just wealthy women, like queer people and so on. But secondly, they also explain why the exclusion of men happens more in second wave feminism due to gender separatism and so on, which is where I think that CO was able to flip CG on the metric of which side is better able to get buy-in such that it flips the election. How does CO weigh against the top half? So I think I already kind of dealt with CO against opening government, in that a lot of the responses from closing opposition does symmetricize opening government substantially, in that CO points out it is not firstly, that second wave feminism also used to be radical, but secondly, especially in relation to the point about the movement becoming contradictory, I think Upwith is able to point out that different movements can exist in different geographical locations, such that even if the feminist movement on net have some contradictory messaging, it is likely that those things do not create the harms that opening government identifies, because those different movements exist in different locations. And additionally, I think Upwith or CEO explains that a lot of the benefits that opening government and closing government wants to argue with regards to wage gap, with regards to contraception, are better pushed through when you have choice and agency at the center of the movement, is where I think CEO is able to co-opt the benefit from opening government. Finally, in the upbench, I think that the reason why CEO is able to get above opening opposition is, firstly, I think CEO provides much more specific reasons why the second wave feminism was problematic, because O stops at suggesting that the second wave feminism was underrepresented, it was broadly dominated by white women and so on, which I think is vulnerable to GovBench response about how, well, but these people still have incentive to be inclusionary for so long as they want their movement to succeed. What I think I get from member of opposition that weighs CO against OO is the claim that the reason why the movement becomes more white-centric is because it is usually the wealthy white women that have more time to participate in the movement. They are privileged enough to donate to the movement. There is a chilling effect of being judged by the central leaders and so on. So I think CO does supply some specific reasons why the second wave feminism has been particularly exclusionary, such that the emphasis on intersectionality is important, which I think gets above opening opposition. But additionally, I think in terms of the second wave feminism underrepresenting or second wave feminism being bad, I think O's explanation is second wave feminism is underrepresented and therefore they don't get as much buy-in. What I get from CO is second wave feminism have advocated for concretely bad policies like carceralist policies and so on, which I think is much more straightforward way to claim that the second wave feminism has less buy-in and therefore has less effectivity. But additionally, I think CO just kind of implicitly weighs that, well, even if second wave feminism is successful, the policies that they were advocating is actually problematic, which I think is a stronger response to government bench than what I get from OO. So that is it for the oral adjudication. Hope it made sense. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, feel free to leave to the breakout room, or sorry, main room.
Thank you so much. We'll message you for
Thank you.
feedback.
Thank you so much. We'll message you for feedback.